Welcome to State of Mind, being human and living well.
And living well.
And living well.
And living well.
I'm the producer and host, Deborah Sloss, licensed marriage and family therapist, and my pronouns are she, her. Last year, about 13% of students here in California's kindergarten to 12th grade public schools received individualized services for special needs, up from about 10% in the early 2000s. Navigating the special education landscape can be daunting for parents trying to get the best education for their children. And this topic has often come up in my work as a psychotherapist, a clinical supervisor, and as a support group leader for the National Alliance on Mental Illness. So I'm excited today to be doing this interview in the hopes of creating a primer for parents and caregivers of students who may be needing additional support in order to successfully access their education. In today's show, we're going to be specifically talking about how to navigate the school system when your student has special needs. This process can become increasingly complicated and difficult when a student's special needs involve hidden disabilities like neurodivergent neurology as seen in attention deficit disorder and autism spectrum, and with mental health conditions like bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, and anxiety. For this conversation, we're joined by educator and instructional designer and parent of a son with special needs, Ann Childers. We're also joined by licensed educational psychologist and independent educational evaluation specialist, Dr. Catherine Keithley. Let me tell you more about our guests. Ann Childers is an educator, speaker, and instructional designer with over 2 decades of experience in collaboration with nonprofit organizations and school districts. Based in California, she's deeply committed to advancing educator development through transformative social and emotional learning and the art of storytelling. In her experience as a parent navigating a child with health needs in the public school system, Ann advocates for an assets-based approach and speaks to the discrepancies between healthcare and school care. Also with us is Dr. Catherine Keithley, who goes by Katie for short, and is a licensed educational psychologist and a board-certified sports psychologist with state certification in school psychology. She also holds a PsyD in clinical psychology and an MA in clinical psychology. She has also taught psychoeducational courses at the Cal State Monterey Bay's Special Education Department and consults and conducts assessments within the greater Monterey Bay area in an effort to improve the lives of students residing there, as well as their opportunities for athletic development. Dr. Katie specializes in difficult cases when school districts and parents don't agree. These cases are called independent educational evaluations, also known as IEEs, and we'll talk more about that later in our program. So welcome to State of Mind, Dr. Katie and Ann.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here with Dr. Katie, who has helped our family tremendously.
Dr. Katie, let's go ahead and start with you. Could you give us an overview of what special education is, who it's for, and why it's important that all parents and caregivers have some understanding about this?
Yeah, I think it can be a really confusing process, but I'll start with the basics. An individual education plan, or what we call an IEP, is something that you have to qualify for and be tested for. And there's 13 disabling conditions that you can qualify under. Those are specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, other health impairment, meaning you have a health impairment that is impacting your education, autism, intellectual disability, emotional disturbance, developmental delay is something that happens earlier on, multiple disabilities, hearing impairment, orthopedic impairment, visual impairment, traumatic brain injury, and deaf and blindness. So those are how you qualify to get services. Typically, speech and language is first identified early on when children are little. We notice that their language may be delayed or their motor is delayed, and Oftentimes that kind of triggers parents and also pediatricians to get the ball started. So the way that that might look is when you go into a pediatrician's office and they have you fill out one of those developmental forms, they'll look over that and see if there's a delay there. And oftentimes that gets referred to the school district. And there's something called an IFSP, which happens before children are the age of 3. So children can qualify to get those services early on.
How early?
I think it's 18 months. And then once they turn 3, there's a reassessment done by the school district to see if they need special education services in preschool.
Can you just talk about some of the reasons why all parents, even parents who think that their child may not need those early services, why is it important that they know something about this process and how it works in schools?
I think even if they don't need them right away, things can develop, and it's always good to know your options, especially options that are free to you. It looks a little bit different when kids are placed in private school, but if you're going to your local school, these are free services for your child if they qualify for them.
Yeah, and in the realm that I work in, I would say that many people aren't don't come into an awareness about this whole system and process until their children are older because they're often seeking some support around mental health conditions that may not be evident in a young child's life, but may become more evident as they, enter middle school or even high school sometimes. So,
Yeah, I think typically if they aren't addressed when the child is earlier, we see it transform into more of a mental health issue. So once again, going back to that early intervention and getting the tools that they need earlier could prevent mental health issues for middle school and high schoolers.
and could you talk some about the steps and different levels of how students gain access to support and then also special education and tell about what each level of support is called and what that means?
Yeah, so the districts go by least restrictive environment. So we always want to see kids in an environment where it's not as restrictive. So let's go with the continuum. So on one side of the continuum, we have the general education classroom, which is where most kids fall. We want them to have access to general ed. But if we see that kids need more support, then it might go into resource-based learning, which would look like A, you have to qualify for those services under one of those disability criterias. And B, it could look like a child gets pulled out of the classroom to get extra reading support, or it can look like somebody coming into the general ed classroom. And then from there, the next step would be maybe a special day class or what we call an SDC, where they're only in a classroom with other kids with, disabilities, and they're really getting a lot more instructional service there all day. So they're not with their regular peers. And then after that, some kids are at a home hospital where they can't go to school and they need somebody to come over to the house to work with them. And then, kind of, the most restrictive that we would think is having an aide at school or being placed in another facility or another private school with a lot more resources. And I've dealt with some of those cases before, which can be a little bit tricky.
And then also there's a lot of confusion about what these different like kinds of support are called. You know, there is sometimes in elementary schools starting with sort of a student study team, and then sometimes there's an actual 504 plan, and then there's an IEP. Could you talk some about the distinction between those different levels of support?
Yeah, so a student study team or an SST is really a general education function. It's not part of special ed at all. And that kind of goes back to that least restrictive environment that talked about. So, what that looks like is the parent parents, the teachers, the principal all come together and we just talk about the issues and it's documented. And they try to put in things that they can do in the general education classroom to help. For example, maybe sitting in the front of the class, sending home a book so parents can review it, but before a test. So there's things that we can do without special education. So that's typically the first step to see if that works. Sometimes that needs to be bypassed because the needs are obviously way greater than that. And I help parents advocate for that. It's like, this is a way bigger need and we're not gonna waste our time with a SST, but for a lot of kids, it's very helpful.
Can we just give some examples like a psychiatric evaluation or a psychological evaluation or a doctor's letter
Yes.
all
Yeah.
would qualify then?
Well, the district will look at it. Just they have a law that says we have to take into consideration what outside sources say, but they don't necessarily have to do it. And that's where the tricky part sometimes can be. But typically, I found with 504s, they're pretty open to it. So submitting that would be a good step. And then districts do an evaluation where they look over everything to see if you qualify for a 504. And then it's a plan where you have accommodations and you meet and you go over all of the accommodations for your child. And then that happens once a year. So typically they're reviewed every year because, the child is going into a different grade and it might look different. And I always tell parents, don't rely on the school district to do that. You say, hey, I had this 504. I want to have another meeting. Make it very well known to educators because they sometimes will overlook it. And then the IEP process is a lot more intense, and you can write a letter and within 15 days the district has to respond by written request. And they will either send you a prior written notice saying, no, we're not going to do the assessment because of X, Y, and Z, or they'll say, yes, we will do the assessment, and here's an assessment plan, and they have 60 days to complete it.
And also, I think it's important for people to know that many private schools will also honor 504s. They may call them different things, but they will do similar kinds of plans with parents to meet students' needs. And I think it's important to make that distinction between accommodation versus modification. Could you talk a little bit about, because that is one of the big distinctions, isn't it, between a 504 and an IEP?
Yeah, I think what really is the biggest distinction for me is services. 504s typically don't have services. I've been involved with a couple cases where they might have access with a 504 to some counseling and things like that. But typically when we think of an IEP, we think of goals based upon the disability and what we saw in the assessment, and then services to remediate those goals. So that's the biggest distinction.
Can you also, you talked a little bit about this, but if there's anything more you want to say about the different ways a student might begin receiving support services or be brought into the whole continuum of the special ed process. So from even starting with the SST that you talked about, the student study team, like what kinds of things bring students into that system where they're being looked at and evaluated in order to see how to meet their needs?
Yeah, I think it can be parent concerns. It can be teacher concerns. Twice a year they do state testing. It could be really low testing scores that where the school's like, you know what, we need to do something different for this student. So I think it could start there. It could start through an outside evaluation or a doctor's note. So there's a number of ways to kind of start that process and get that going.
So in the show, we're primarily focused on what we might call the hidden disabilities, things like neurological differences, ADHD or autism spectrum, or mental health conditions like bipolar disorder, anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, or even learning differences like dyslexia or dysgraphia. So because these disabilities are hidden, It's often a child's behaviors that are the indicator that they might need additional support. So I'm wondering, Dr. Katie, can you talk a bit more about what kinds of behaviors might parents and caregivers be seeing that would indicate a student might need additional support?
Well, I think, inattention is a really big one nowadays when we see kids not paying attention in class. I think that oftentimes they jump to go see the pediatrician and get a diagnosis of ADHD, which could be correct or it could be not correct because uh, doctors just give a rating scale and then have parents and teachers fill it out, which is not a very thorough assessment to look at something like that. So, because it could look like an auditory processing deficit, if a kid's not paying attention. But I think attention is a big one. Kids feeling really bad about school, not feeling successful is another huge red flag. Social issues, not being able maybe to communicate with peers or do well on the playground is something that I've seen a lot. So those would be, pretty big red flags for me. And teachers do a really pretty good job of paying attention to see is Johnny suffering? Is he not keeping up with in class and letting administration know.
From what I've heard happen outside of school, though, there will be things like homework meltdowns or school avoidance, really hard time getting the kids to school in the morning. Or maybe they do okay all day, but the minute you pick them up, they're just falling apart or blowing up.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me of that. The homework is such a big issue. And I think there's too much homework given. When kids are in school all day and they're trying really hard, and let's say they have a disability, to then send them home and have more work to do, I think there's a saturation point where I know us as adults, like you can't receive any more information. It's not productive anymore. And so oftentimes I advocate for only having kids read at home, and that can look like parents even just read to them. So yeah, and I think school avoidance, has to be treated, that's a tricky one. There could be a number of reasons why they avoid school, and having the work be too hard could be one of them. Having being bullied, could be another. But there's a lot of support that we can do even before the school day happens to make them feel better. But those are definitely red flags, and kids with a lot of anxiety do tend to hold it together all day, and then when they get home it's like, they just can't hold it together anymore.
So, Anne, I want to come to you now. You're here with us today to share your story about accessing special education for your son. Can you tell us how that began and how did your son come into the special education system?
Sure. So my son started receiving services from a very young age, like Dr. Katie was describing. He started receiving services, I think between 2 and 3. I'd have to check the records. That was a while ago now, but he also attended a special education preschool 1 day a week while he was attending a private preschool several days a week at that time. And so fast forward, he will be in 5th grade now, but I just want to keep into consideration for this conversation that he was in kindergarten when the pandemic hit. And so he was in kindergarten when schools shut down. 1st grade was on Zoom. Those were not learning conditions for him. 2nd grade was really about a mask. There's speech and language issues, so communication was very difficult with a mask. And 3rd grade, we had some real challenges with access to academics and unaddressed social situations at school. So I it's been hard to give him a fair shot in this, and it's been super messy in this important conversation because we are in a time post-pandemic where these students needs are still not being met and addressed. And our grade level system, the educator part of me is like, our grade level system is kind of falling apart for students with disabilities at the moment, particularly those with younger years that didn't learn how to read basic math functions Yet we keep going.
Or even just all that social milieu, right, was just missed for so many students.
Correct.
You're listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and today we're discussing the public special education system in place to support students who have special needs of any kind, including mental health. And for this conversation, we're joined by educator, instructional designer, and parent of a son with special health needs, Ann Childers. We're also joined by licensed educational psychologist and independent educational evaluation specialist, Dr. Catherine Keithley. Back to our interview. Can you say something about how, you said he came in at age 2 or 3, but you didn't say how he came in. Like what was the identifier? Who was the person, or how did you get steered toward those services so early for your son?
Well, I mean, I've probably 15 years, 20, I'm trying to think how old he is and how many years I was in education by the time he was born, but I had decades of education experience so I consult with friends, I consult with people I know in the industry and special education. And, but health-wise, speech and language delays were probably the number one component.
Mhm. And you saw that yourself. You were noticing that and talking with people about that, and then you were aware that these services were available.
Yeah, I mean, I've taught kindergarten, I've worked, working education has given me a leg up in
Yeah.
this, and I still find it extremely difficult to navigate. It's tricky, I think, as a parent because development is quite different, particularly with health needs. And I remember when he was quite young getting like a assessment that it was like at 18 months you should stack 6 blocks, and 24 months you should stack 8 blocks, and just kind of being skeptical of some of the assessments and the markers for those with developmental delays. It's like, you can't really put them on the same track, yet they are. I think a lot changed for me professionally as I started to navigate schools as a parent. I really realized what a strong ally it takes as a parent to really be attentive to what's happening in the schools. And, I've had some unique professional opportunities to work across the country at national levels. I've designed a lot of tools that my work is basically in how do we create conditions for learning in gen ed classrooms. And I was really struck mostly by the lack of attention to those conditions for learning and the focus on the problem of the child without an assessment of those conditions. So, I think what I realized is this is going to take a lot of time and money to navigate, which is a resource that I have available to me and the knowledge in there. But, as an advocate for underserved populations and historically marginalized populations in school, that's not an access that everybody has. So I think what changed for me was this path of advocacy beyond my son.
And I just want to interrupt you for a minute because I want to ask if you could just give our listeners some idea about what are the kinds of things that fall in that category of like other health or health conditions that you're talking about that are often not seen or recognized by school systems.
Yeah, I mean, I think in education, we often refer to them as behavior issues, and I really has come to see them through my son in this experience as health issues. And for example, I recently did a teacher training and I around neuroaffirming practices, and I put up a slide that had from understood.org, which is a great organization around learning differences, some characteristics of what ADHD in a K2 student might look like. And, things like they might grab things from other students, they might not wait in line. And so, I pose the question, how are we designing from the get-go? When we kind of add on, right? Like You don't have access to reading instruction. You don't have access to alternative seating. You don't have access to a design that is aware of your health condition, the learning conditions, and even more importantly, the psychological impact of not accessing education are horrific as a parent. I mean, I was picking my son up from school by the second grade. He's saying, "They're right, Mom, I'm stupid."
That's heartbreaking.
Completely.
Yeah. And I think knowing him, and him going into the other, another school environment and seeing the success that he had there, the environment makes such a huge difference for kids learning. And that's one thing that I see too when I go into the schools. It's like we're still operating in the 1950s. Nothing really has, maybe evolved a little bit, but it's still very, very archaic to me with everything that we know about kids now, which is unfortunate.
Exactly. So I kept pressing on some of the systemic challenges in our system is that we have these systems in California where we like tier kids, right? Tier 1 kids, what all services should get. Tier 2 kids get some interventions, and tier 3 have more intensive supports. But the challenge is we have sort of an upside down triangle at the moment. And
Upside down triangle, meaning that so many kids need support. Is that what you mean?
correct, but there's not an evaluation of the base. For example, they came in and did a FBA or a Dr. Hayes, functional behavioral analysis. Is
Yeah.
that what that is? Okay.
Yeah.
On my son, I had two issues. One, there was no conditions for learning assessed. So can he see? Can he hear? Can he access? Is he comfortable sitting? If we follow the neuroscience of learning, Dr. Helen Immordino Yang says you neurobiologically can't learn what's not important to you. And so, there's none of these conditions assessed, nothing asked of the child that way or the family. I was never consulted on any of these things. My second issue here is that the person conducting the analysis, which led to a one-to-one, was the person that the district outsources the services to. So there's some conflicts of interest happening too.
And one-on-one, do you want to define that, Dr. Katie, just so our listeners know what a one-on-one is?
An aid that, is with the child either for parts of the day or all day. And as I mentioned before, parents call me and they say, well, I really want an aid for my child. And I have to explain that's, first of all, that's very restrictive with the way that the district sees it. So you're not going to go from having an SST and then jumping over to getting a one-on-one aid. That's much more laborious process. One, because they determine it so restrictive. Two, it's a lot of money for them and they want to make sure it's appropriate. But I think that's a big misnomer. There has to be a lot of intervention done before, we'll even consider a one-on-one aid, because you don't want to you don't want to make kids dependent upon somebody else. So it has to be used, in such a way, and that's why, Anson had an assessment for that. And I agree with the conflict of interest, absolutely, and have seen that.
Yeah, and I don't feel like that process was really, I mean, we're also talking post-pandemic, right? So I'm like, there's part of me that has this lens of get my son as much support as he can to kind of gain the academic and social skills that he lost during this time. And I think in hindsight, it ended up causing more challenges than successes for him. And, one thing that I really didn't realize was how critical the paper trail of each child is. And Katie was talking about different environments. So he has gone several times to a summer school, Chartwell in Monterey Bay, that specializes in unique differences and is a beautiful place. And the paper trails are so different in different conditions for learning. And in the context, that's why I'm such really an advocate for really paying such attention to these conditions that we place the child in. My child was being threatened daily. There were some real unaddressed issues. And so, the success that I'm seeing in him now, it was not from these additional services. For us, this is not always the case. For us, it caused more challenges.
So what you're saying is that for your son in particular, what was really important was moving to an environment where he felt more supported and safer versus the actual services that he was receiving. So I think that is a really good point, that sometimes the mix is, how do we add more support around the student where they are? And sometimes the answer is, how do we move the student to an environment where they might do better? And that's a hard thing. And I think often parents need to get other input to assess that and figure that out.
Yes, it's incredibly tricky, and I'm incredibly fortunate that I was been able to do this for him,
Mhm.
because now we have, at the end of the day with school districts, a lot of it is in the documentation, and I really wish I had paid better attention earlier to the notes in the IEP, to some of these things that I just didn't really realize were important and would impact finding other places later for when seeking different environments. Some of the alternatives to public school, I'll say, including non-public schools, private schools, I'm finding in California at least, and I hear this, are highly impacted post-pandemic. So, you know, I can't thank Dr. Katie enough for providing a clear analysis of the capabilities of him. And, you know, I've thought about this a lot, Dr. Katie, and you're essentially, the support that you gave us, pointed us in a direction where we were just lost. Like, schools want to throw more instructional minutes, and I question, like, what are the conditions in those minutes? So if I'm seeking extra reading support, but I'm getting pulled out and I'm not being taught by an instructor that is housed in the science of reading for those with learning disabilities, are those minutes valuable? Are they worthwhile? I mean, schools are obsessed with minutes. They're not obsessed with outcomes.
So, Dr. Katie, I just wonder if you could outline, what are the usual steps a parent or caregiver can go through with a school when they're seeing behaviors that might indicate that their student may need additional support at school?
I think you need to do a little research, or do a consult with somebody like me and really determine what you would like to get out of the situation. Oftentimes, I think that can be confusing. It's like, what do you think would be helpful? But I think just starting bringing it up to your teacher, or the principal. I like putting everything in writing, sending an email, just like Anne was saying, having a record history of it. And I always recommend to parents, just keep a binder, print out everything and keep it all in there so that you have your own documentation and it's all organized, so that if you need to bring that up, that you have it all together. But I think the first step would be bringing it up, talking to your pediatrician about what they're seeing, would be number one.
I work essentially a lot in teachers understanding biases. And I think one thing that I wish I would have done and I also want to iterate the importance of the email, the documentation, that the conversations face to face later have no value in a way. And so the importance of that. And also, I would encourage anyone to reach out to many different people at a school if they feel comfortable, not just a classroom teacher, but anybody. Is there a PE teacher? Is there different classes that they're in? Are there folks that they can ask that are not just one person's viewpoint, because of the importance of the difference in learning contexts and where children thrive? So multiple perspectives can help.
Yeah, and I think even asking to go in and observe yourself. I do that with my daughters a lot. I like to volunteer in the classroom. And then, I can see what's going on. I can also talk to them about anything that I've noticed after school. And for kids that are a little older, getting their perspective is so important. I always ask kids, especially when I'm assessing them, what would make school helpful for you? What do you think that you would like to see? What's hard? What's easy? They have a lot of information if you just take the time to talk to them.
I think 100% understanding your own student's experience and really honoring their experience, you know? Our public education system is not it's not what it needs to be in a lot of spots. And the trust in your child's experience, like when students tell me things about that happened at school, I think a lot of adults are like, "Oh, that could never happen. Teachers make that stuff up." And I'm like, I really believe the students. I've been in hundreds, maybe 1,000 classrooms at this point, and the students' experience is really the feedback that matters. And I
Mhm.
will share recently in a different condition, right? We talked about my son saying, "They're right, mom, I'm stupid." Different conditions for learning. He recently, after a summer school experience, this was day 2, although he'd been there for summer school before. I picked him up and he says, "You know what, mom? Chartwell loves me." That's a whole lot of information in 2 sentences there.
You're listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and we're discussing the public special education system in place to support students who have special needs of any kind, including mental health. We'll also discuss where parents and caregivers can find additional support in navigating this process. For this conversation, we're joined by educator and instructional designer and parent of a son with special needs, Ann Childers. We're also joined by licensed educational psychologist and independent educational evaluation specialist, Dr. Catherine Keithley. Every State of Mind episode has a resource list, and any we talk about today are included in the show notes for this episode. We've also included transcriptions and closed captions too. So go to www.stateofmindmedia.org to find all that in the episode's show notes. Now, let's get back to our interview. So, Anne, I think you might be able to speak to this because this is something I hear often is that maybe a family has a 504 plan in place for their student, but those accommodations are not actually being implemented. Or, you might speak to this too, Dr. Katie, after when it's an IEP that the things aren't being implemented. So what have you found just from your firsthand experience, and when what's agreed upon isn't actually being implemented? What's the best way you found to address this with schools?
I think back to the email documentation, your own observations, asking the child, asking for any kind of data on the individual services. You can check credentials online sometimes. Like, is this, I think there's like a lot of public things. I mean, for example, there was an incident with my son that I questioned, and they said, "Oh, well, it's a, no, oh, this was I happen to know the teacher because I've done a lot of new teacher support, and they said, "Oh, this is a credentialed, special education teacher." And I'm like 20 seconds on the internet finding out that's not true. So I think, keep questioning and keep believing your child.
And Dr. Katie, what advice would you have? What have you found the best way to address when a plan is not being implemented, how to address that with the school?
Call an IEP meeting right away. Get that documented. I often recommend having a binder that goes back and forth between, whoever the case provider is and you, so that you can see what's going on throughout the day. I always ask parents I work with, let's see a schedule, and oftentimes that's not given. I like to see a printed schedule of when the services are happening, when the breaks are, who's there. But if you feel that something is off, call an IEP meeting and think about what you want the goal of the IEP meeting to be. And I like to go in with the answers and not ask them, but already have the answers myself.
That's hard for parents to
Sometimes it
know.
is, yeah.
Yeah, it can be hard. I mean, I think, you have to 24 hours in advance to record your IEP. You have to ask requests. So that's important to know because you can ask for recordings and then you can have access to what was talked about later because they're so emotional for parents. I oftentimes get off and I'm so emotional. That's why I ended up getting part of why I ended up getting an advocate myself was I didn't feel clear during these times because it was so hard to hear all the deficits. And I think support, if you can, an advocate is how I ended up finding methods, and they're expensive, and that's a really unjust part of our system at the moment.
But, just like going to medical appointments, I want to make a point that sometimes an advocate can be having a second parent there. Sometimes an advocate can be having a friend or a family member who's there taking notes, observing, and not caught up in all of the level of emotion. Because, of course, when your child's success is at stake here, it is really emotional for parents, and it is hard to hear and process information clearly at that time. So I'm so glad you mentioned about the importance of recording, but people do have access to other kinds of advocates too that can really be helpful in those times. And Dr. Katie, you were about to say?
Yeah, I was gonna say always request paperwork ahead of time. For me, when I'm working with families, I send my assessment at least a week before there's a meeting and maybe even have a meeting with them before the actual IEP meeting. Because to sit with all of this paperwork that's legal documentation and then go over, a 20 or 30-page assessment in an hour and then get something out of it for your kid, I think is unreasonable.
I've gotten a IEP, an hour before the meeting.
So wait, when you're talking about that, I want to clarify for listeners what you mean is you've gotten a multi-page document that is both giving you information about what they're seeing when your son and making all the suggestions about how they might be addressing that. That's what you're receiving, you're saying an hour before the meeting, right? And so I want to come out of that really saying how important it is. And this is something that I didn't know as I went through this process the first time is that as a parent, you don't have to sign that document in the meeting, that you can go home and reread it and think about it. You can listen to the recording again. So, Dr. Katie, do you want to say anything else that's really important for parents to know?
Yeah, I mean, that's totally within your right to make sure that you understand all of that, and they should be able to explain it to you. And, it's always okay to pause meetings. I was in a meeting about a year ago, and somebody else was presenting their report, and the parent was crying and couldn't take in any information. And the person that was presenting the report kept talking. And I had to say, we need to take a break here. We need to stop and make sure the parent is okay, maybe go outside. You know, you have as much right as anybody else sitting at that table to ask questions, take your time, and, have a second meeting if needed.
100%. I wish I would have done that at times. There was a time similar to what you're recalling when we got a really, I'll say, damaging feeling document just before the IEP. And I said, I don't want to go over this document and this assessment. I feel like it's inaccurate and has language that is inappropriate. And during the IEP, I was completely ignored and they continued to just read the document that I'd already read and said, "I don't wanna talk about this." My spouse started crying and got up and left, and I had to pause the meeting, and I said, "You just lost the most important stakeholder in this child's life." And the other 12 people on Zoom had no response.
Mm. So, Dr. Katie, you and I happened to meet at a symposium, and you told me about how you were an IEE provider, an independent educational evaluation provider. And I had never heard of that. So, despite my own experience navigating the 504 process and the IEP process with one of my sons, this was something I never fully understood and was not provided access to. So, can you tell us about what an independent educational evaluation is and how would it come into play in the process of seeking support for a student with disabilities?
Yeah, so an IEE or independent educational evaluation is somebody that does not work with the district. It's an independent person, so basically a third party that comes in and looks and sees what assessments have been done and conducts a new assessment. Um, so what typically happens is parents don't agree with the district's assessment and they will request an IEE. The county has a list of IEE people that are qualified to do it because there's certain qualifiers that you need. And typically people will pick from that list. I suggest calling and talking to that person ahead of time, making sure it's a good fit for your family. And then they do their own independent evaluation. So when I do it, I go back from the very start and do what I call a forensic examination of school records. So I go back and I look at goals, services, everything that I can get my hands on to understand the situation from the very beginning. And oftentimes I can kind of see where the wheels come off.
So you're looking at the paper trail, both at the school and sometimes even the paper trail that the parent might have?
The medical paperwork I oftentimes request, so I integrate those two fields within my report, which, as Anne was mentioning, they often aren't integrated at all. In the medical field, they can have a lot of really good information that the school district never considers for even the qualifying criteria. So when we talk about maybe an other health impairment, and the doctor has done certain tests to determine that there's a severe health impairment, going back and looking at those records, pinpointing when it happens. Sometimes I will even call and interview the doctor. So, which will all help understand the background of the student. And then I go into my own evaluation, which is typically much more in depth. I pick and choose the assessments that I see fit for the child, especially when they come to see me. One thing that I've seen oftentimes is a child with a speech and language disability is given an IQ test that is heavily speech and language based. And districts will often say they have a lower IQ. So I have to go in and correct things like that's the child's whole future. So you have to be careful with what you give and what you say. But that is, free to you.
Wait, can you say that again to parents? I think that's really important. Explain how that is free to parents.
It is free to you to get a second opinion, to get an outside evaluation done. What I've seen happen lately is districts not wanting to pay the full cost of the evaluation and asking parents to cover the other half. This is a very, very slippery slope because oftentimes parents don't have the money to pay for the other half. So does that mean they don't get the third opinion? That to me is a violation of the law. And I actually emailed the state about it because I was so concerned with one family. And basically, they said they could ask, the districts could ask, but it ultimately goes down to they have to pay for it.
I really am glad you brought that up about parents really need to be an advocate because that was what the point I wanted to come back to, which is implied in almost everything, Anne, that you've said and that you've been talking about, Dr. Katie, is what parents don't understand is once a child is struggling, for them to actually successfully get supports throughout their educational career, the parent has a whole new job. And it's a really big job. And to know that they actually have to step in to become an advocate for their child. And we see this all the time in my volunteer work with NAMI, National Alliance on Mental Illness, is that, as soon as their child has a diagnosis, there's a whole new job that they have associated with the school district and working with their school around how to support that student related to their education. So you've implied that, but I just want to explicitly say it. It's a new job, and it's important to see it as that. So, Dr. Katie, are there resources you'd want to share that are related to students with disabilities and special education that could be helpful for our listeners?
Yeah, one is called How to Obtain an Independent Educational Evaluation at Public Expense. I also have that on my website, which I'm sure is going to be listed in the resources. There's also IE guidelines that a charter SELPA Over the Hill put out that's very comprehensive. And I really like childmind.org. They have a lot of good information on there. They have videos. One of the ones that I put on was inside an educational evaluation, so you know what to expect and all of the different parts of it. So I like to tell parents way ahead of time all of the different steps that we're going to go through and what is it going to look at the like at the end so that you know the process and you know where you're at in the process.
And Anne, are there any special education related resources that you've also found to be valuable?
I really have found the work of understood.org, which is from an organization CAST that works for the tagline says everyone deserves to be understood, for parent resources, for educator resources. I think secondly is the Sold Alliance because I'm fascinated with the science of learning and the conditions under which we follow that science, and to understand a little bit more about learning might help you advocate for the science of learning for where you might see gaps in the system.
Great, thank you. I also want to mention that there are organizations in all communities that are funded by the state to support parents around accessing education for disabilities. And in our area for the Monterey Bay, but also throughout California, there's an organization called Parents Helping Parents, and they have a huge library. They also will have other parents consult with you as you're going through this process, and they often will do trainings for parents around understanding this whole process and how to be an ally and an advocate for your child within it. So, Parents Helping Parents is the one that is regional and helps families throughout California, but there also exist in other communities. So, you could ask your district about that. And all the resources that we talk about will be listed and more on our resource list. So, if you want to find out more, please check that out. So, it went way too fast, Dr. Katie, but I want to ask what last few points might you want to leave our listeners with?
I think one that I'd like to go back is just trusting your instincts on what your child needs and be their advocate, but still remaining that listening to the educators around you and what they're telling you and try to balance those things. Early intervention is the key to having success with learning and mental needs. So oftentimes parents will say, "Oh, I've been putting this off for 2 to 3 years." Don't put these things off, just address them. Sometimes there's embarrassment or thinking that things will just magically get better. I find it's better to be on top of things and solving them early on when you see them. So having some ownership there and getting their ideas and taking that into account, and reaching out for support. There's a lot of people out have been through things that, are extremely helpful. So getting on it early.
Thank you. And is there something you wish you had understood earlier in your journey helping your son navigate the special education system?
Yeah, I think one of the things I think is just to really question your own beliefs about what a disability means and what strengths based means. And I think we're living in a time where neurodiverse adults are making our movies and they're writing our books. And how can you harness that and love that and not see it in a grade level way? It's just beyond this capacity of educators to see other ways of knowing and doing. We have very strict ways in our public school system and general education around ways of knowing and being. And I have found so much beauty in understanding other ways of thinking about the world and in absorbing that and empowering that. And I'll tell you a very quick story. My son, he's become obsessed with long words now that his reading capacities have improved. And he said to me, "Mom, what does mentality mean?" And I said, well, it's like how you think about things or maybe how you approach things. I said, "Is there a way that you approach things?" And he said, "I try my best with compassion." And the emotional and social intelligence and knowledge of oneself to be able to articulate from a person who has speech and language issues is like my new North Star. So look to your child for what they give you, for what they can offer, from what they're learning. If we all tried our best with compassion, where would we be?
You've been listening to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well.
And living well.
And living well.
Living well.
And living well.
I want to say a huge thank you to our guests today, Ann Childers and Dr. Catherine Keithley, for this important conversation. And thanks to you for joining us. To learn more, check out the wealth of information included on the resource list in the show notes for this episode. New episodes of State of Mind exploring mental health and wellness are released the first Sunday of every month and can be found along with our complete archive on our website at www.stateofmindmedia.org. If you missed part of this episode or you just want to hear it again, subscribe to our podcast on all the major podcast platforms. Also, when you rate and review our podcast, you really do help it get found and heard by more listeners. So if you like this or any of our episodes, could you please do that for us? Special thanks to Youssef Hassanain for audio production, Patrice Vecchione for In Your Voice story coaching, Patty Palmer for transcriptions, Rebecca Levy for media outreach, and Katrina Tattenham for advanced research. And thanks to acoustic guitarist Adrian Legg for composing, performing, and donating the use of our theme music. State of Mind was developed and originally broadcast in association with KSQD-FM in Santa Cruz, California. We always want to hear from listeners and community members just like you. You can submit your very own In Your Voice recording and become part of the conversation by either calling in to leave a message or recording an audio file right on your phone. Submission details can be found at www.stateofmindmedia.org. Come on back and join us again next month for a whole new episode of State of Mind. Until then, live well.